Welcome to our latest podcast episode, where we dive deep into the heart of entrepreneurship and innovation. I'm your host, Rishi Roy, and alongside my co host, Gautam, we are thrilled to present a conversation that's bound to inspire, educate, and provoke thought. We have joined by Professor George Abbey, a distinguished professor of entrepreneurship from UCLA, who has not only shaped the minds of future leaders, but also has been at the forefront of entrepreneurship and venture capital himself. In this episode, Professor Abbey shares unparalleled wisdom from his journey through the realms of academia, venture capitalism, and beyond. We'll explore the origins of ideas, the true essence of entrepreneurship, the multifaceted risk entrepreneurs face, and much more. Professor Abbey's perspectives on navigating the startup ecosystem, his take on the importance of intellectual property, and his personal narrative transitioning into academia offer a rare glimpse into the life of a person who has witnessed the evolution of entrepreneurship firsthand. So, whether you are an aspiring entrepreneur, a seasoned business owner, or simply intrigued by the innovation landscape, this conversation is tailored for you. Join us as we uncover the layers of entrepreneurship through the eyes of someone who has lived it, taught it, and continues to influence it. So let's dive right in. So I was curious. I, I wanted to know where do you think ideas come from, and you know as a founder, I think that's one of the challenges. People want to start startups. They say, I'm very keen to have my own business, create a startup, but then get stuck on ideas and they wonder, where do these ideas come from? So I wanted to know from your point of view, where do you believe ideas come from? And how do you ascertain the potential of an idea?
Um, Ideas come from a lot of places, and if a young person says, "I want to be an entrepreneur," but doesn't have any ideas, then the immediate question is, "Why do you want to be an entrepreneur?" I think being an entrepreneur for the sake of entrepreneurship is silly. So you have to have some kind of way of, of framing the questions. Most people think the path to entrepreneurship is to solve a problem. Um, that's okay, but it's not the only way. And some very successful entrepreneurs have not taken that approach. For example, uh, other ways to be an entrepreneur are transplantation. That is, you take an idea that works elsewhere, and then you just move it to where you are. Now, there's no problem solving there. There's nothing particularly ingenious about it, but it's just a way that people think about the world and say, well, I'll do what the other guy did, and I'll just do it where they're not doing it. I think transplantation has a reasonably good track record, and people don't think enough about that. You mentioned in your other questions about acquisition and spinoffs. I think acquisition and spinoffs are good ways to be an entrepreneur. In fact, they're probably better ways to be an entrepreneur than to start a company from scratch. And that's later in your question list, but we can get to that at some point. But that's just another way of thinking about the idea of a generation problem. I think this whole business of sitting around brainstorming is a waste of time. And I don't encourage that. I know a lot of universities do that, and good for them. But I've never known that to be a successful or useful exercise. There've been a bunch of very good cartoons about that, and I think I'm sympathetic to that. I use some of those cartoons in class. So ideas are where you find them, and they come to you. And um, I mentioned transplantation, solving problems. Some people are fast followers. They see a product that somebody else invented and say, well, I can do that better than the originator. That's a good way to be an entrepreneur. You can ask any situation where there's a highly inefficient market, where the bid-ask spread is very large. There's opportunity there. So there's a lot of ways to think about it, but sitting around brainstorming is the last thing you should do.
Right. Right. George, that actually reminds me of a small anecdote I heard recently from another successful founder here, and he was talking about Dropbox, and and apparently Dropbox went to VCs to the founder of Dropbox went to VCs to get funding, and when he was trying to explain that it's a file sharing system at the very early stage, the VCs pushed back and said, "Don't we have zip file? Don't we have these other options?" And they listed 4 or 5 options, and which are all there. And he then pushed back and said, "Do you use them?" And they said no. And that's why you will use us. And uh, and it's to your point that if you find a system which you can improve on, then that's an idea.
Mhm. Very few products. That exposes another problem of entrepreneurship that we may get on, and that is a lot of entrepreneurs think being first to market is a good thing. Well, I think being first to market is usually a bad thing. Sometimes it works. Of course, there's an exception to everything I'm going to say, but a common misconception is being first to market is good. Uh, and in some cases, it does work, and you are the originator, and you have an exclusivity in the market. That's great if you can keep that advantage. But most people are not funded well enough to keep that advantage.
Yeah. And I think science and management studies and is all about, not about the exceptions. Even in medical science, you have the odd person who smokes all his life and never gets any lung cancer or any disease whatsoever, but that doesn't mean that smoking is safe.
Exactly. Now, I have this in the first lecture of my first class. I have a quotation from an American uh, theater writer, James Thurber, a very famous author and screenwriter in America, or playwright. It's more important to know some of the questions than all of the answers. It's more important to know some of the questions than all the. There are no answers in entrepreneurship. And students are asking me all the time, what is the secret to entrepreneurship? What is the secret to fundraising? What is the secret to team building? What is the secret to product market fit? There are no secrets that are enduring. It's all situational. And my job as a teacher is to tell you where the issues and questions are. Because my answers are not aren't worth a thing. Because there's too much of your situation I don't know. So I get very impatient with people who say they've got the magic bullet. They don't.
So I was going into the question on risks, and in your vast experience, could you share some insights on the key risks entrepreneurs face and how can they mitigate them?
With respect to risk, that is a 3 hour discussion. Now, I'm not going to do it in 3 hours here, but I can tell you most risks are completely overlooked and surprise entrepreneurs because they don't see them all. So the first is product risk. Now, most entrepreneurs say, well, if I can make a prototype, make a product that does what the specifications say, I've fixed the product risk problem. The answer is no. There's a lot more to risk than simply does the thing work, or does it have the functionality you're looking for. Because product risk also involves user interface, it involves replicability, it involves cost, it involves a good test plan, and a lot of risk has to be associated with what additional features can you add to make it a complete product. In class, I teach this notion of basic product and complete product. A basic product is something you buy coming out of a box and it's complete and that's it. Like you buy a car. You buy a car, you drive it. No, an automaker makes money by selling you more than a car. You get service, you get parts. In America, you get financing. And in fact, these other pieces are very often more profitable than selling you the car. So you have to think about this product evolution in order to avoid being commoditized, which is a big product risk, is commoditization. Once you sell a product, the world knows what you're selling, and so they can make it a duplicate. Now, you may have patent protection and all that, maybe not. But even if you do have patent protection, People can still create something that's very similar that presumably doesn't violate your patent. So commoditization is a product risk. And how do you avoid that? Continuous improvement and enhancement. Well, how do you do that? You got to get money. That's product risk. So user interface, cost, product evolution, complete product. These are things people overlook. Then there's market risk. So what is market? Does that mean people won't buy the product? No, of course that's kind of silly. Of course they'll buy the product. So you sell your product. You're an entrepreneur, small company. You sell your product to your friends or their friends, and it's a very small group of people you're selling to right away. You might do something online. People might stumble onto your website, buy a few things, but you're typically at the start going to attract a customer base of people who are interested in buying something from somebody new. That's fine. Problem is, that's about 2.5% of the total market are these early adopters, the early innovators, people who buy from an innovator. Your job is to enter the mainstream market. Well, the mainstream market wants something very different from your early buyers. And most entrepreneurs don't understand the difference between the mainstream market and the initial market. And that's why they die before they get big. So this marketing problem is huge when you start entering mainstream markets, because that's typically where you have to be to get big. Now, if you can survive with a small little tiny niche market and a handful of customers, then that's fine. You've done some good marketing studies. But anyone who thinks they need to enter a mainstream market has a very large marketing task ahead of them that's probably unknown to most entrepreneurs. That's market risk. Then another class of risk is financing risk. That does not mean you're not able to raise money. That's not what that means. The presumption is you're going to raise some money. The problem is not all money is the same. And so people make mistakes in fundraising by getting the wrong amount, either too much or too little. They'll raise it from the wrong people. Namely, they'll raise it from people who can't help them, like friends and family. Or they'll raise it at the wrong time. They may raise it at the worst possible time, or they'll raise a sufficient an amount of money such that the next time they raise money will be the worst possible time. So how do you know when the right time to raise money, and how do you know how much money to raise? Well, we call that experience and judgment. So don't say, well, I'm going to raise as much money as I can, or I'm going to raise as little money as I can. Both work. It's okay sometimes to raise as little money as you can, to move the pawns up the chessboard a little bit, to maybe raise a larger round not too much later. It's also sometimes okay to raise the maximum amount of capital you can in order to avoid fundraising for as long as possible. They both work, but you need to develop a view on what proper fundraising looks like. I call it appropriate money. You have to raise appropriate money, the right amount from the right people at the right time. And so those are just tip of the iceberg. Each one of those is a 1 hour discussion, but I think that gives you an idea of the diversity of risks that entrepreneurs face that they really don't know anything about when they start. So, supply chain risk.
At this point, I'll encourage read our listeners, and I'll put links in our show notes to your book, and so that they can go into much more depth on this topic if should they like to.
The book is 3 years old now, so they might think it's obsolete by now, but in fact, there are some parts of the book that is obsolete now. So,
Some parts, yes, but I think the core concepts don't become obsolete.
So when we talk about the risks, there are some startup founders who believe in doing taking a calculated risk, and they build and launch the MVP product first. But there are some over ambitious startup founders. They take a blind risk, and they end up building a whole product without launching MVP to the market, and they don't have enough money to do for market their product after the launch.
Product development is for most people the least of the problems. Most entrepreneurs are way too enamored of their product. They're in love with their idea. They're in love with their product. Well, that's great. I think you have to like your product. You have to, but that's 50% of the problem. And marketing is a big part. Sales is a big part. People think sales and marketing are the same thing. No, they're not the same thing. And the kind of person who can do good marketing is often not the person who can do good selling. That's another misconception people have. Um, another general problem that entrepreneurs have is they think, and this is particularly true if you're going to business school, is they worry way too much about the market and selling and revenue, and they don't think near enough about their cost, supply chain operations, inventory, logistics, that sort of thing. And then they wonder why they go broke. They're thinking all the time about customers and revenue sources, which is, of course, important. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And that's another trap or risk that people.
George, could you share some memories from your early life and how your heritage as a Japanese influenced your journey into the world of entrepreneurship and capitalism?
Yes, I was surprised by that question. It's a very sensitive and good question. Uh, I can't say on other. I have been on other interviews before. I haven't. I can't say I've been asked that question before, except by other Japanese, which is kind of interesting. Let me say this: I think Japanese have the well-deserved reputation for being conformist, big company people, and unwilling to stick their neck out and take risks. I think that's a fair characterization, but not entirely fair. Some of the best entrepreneurs in the 20th century have come from Japan. Toshiba, Akio Morita, Sony, you know, Mitsubishi, they're just fantastic. But there are not too many of them. I grant that. Conformity is important in Japan, as it is in many Asian cultures. This, I think, less so in South Asia, but certainly in Korea, the Philippines, Southeast, where there was a strong Confucian tradition. Conformity and order are highly prized. Now, what that means is that, particularly in Japan, well, let's start with that part. I've quite a bit to say about this because I think it might be useful for your audience. As far as Japanese in America goes, they've been extremely successful in this country, despite the fact that they were imprisoned, in my view, during World War II. And my parents, grandparents were all basically put in prison camps. You know, how do people survive that situation? Well, the Japanese immigrant experience in the United States is not unlike what Indians experience in the U.S. I would say though, but the Indian experience is a little bit different. One important thing here: the Japanese experience in America is very tightly community oriented because we were all imprisoned, and when you get out, you tend to support each other. You know, my father had a gas station, and there's only one Japanese accountant in Pasadena. That's where you go. There's one church. That's where. So everybody was self-supporting each other culturally, very self-supporting. They never competed against each other, and so it's always, how can I help my uncle, my friend, and everybody moved up together. It's very interesting, and I was very accustomed to that when I was growing up. And then I see other people they're competing against people in their own community. So, well, this is kind of weird. And I do see that in the community in California. They competed against each other. You're from Madras and you're from Bangalore, and we're going to get you, kind of thing. I don't know, maybe I got it wrong, but I don't see that same collegiality in other Asian countries, and certainly not the Chinese. They will fight tooth and nail against each other. They don't fight. I mean, they compete business wise. It's a healthy competition, but so you have this support thing. One thing I want to point out is that Euro or Japanese characters, kanji characters, these it's things you can't read, of course. There is a Japanese character. Uh, it's called shinise. Shinise. Shinise is a interesting word. It means a company which has lasted more than 100 years. Now, in no language in the world do I know you have a single word which means company which lasts 100 years. In Japan right now, there are over 33,000 companies which have lasted over 100 years. It's phenomenal. There's a sake company, makes sake. It was founded in 1637. There's a tea house, famous one in Kyoto. It was founded in 1160, and these are continuously operating businesses for 900 years. Now, what makes that happen? Very interesting cultural question, but I think it gets to the heart of why a lot of Japanese businesses do succeed. And the reason they succeed is because they are that completely intertwined with their local community, like the Japanese in America are. They're completely involved. So it's not a company. It's not workers and customers and the management. It is the entire community which is bought into this, which is why this sake company, Gekkeikan, has been around for almost 380 years. And there are other elements of that too. You do not raise outside capital, and you do not grow big enough for people to try to take over you. Now, these companies are big enough now, but in their formative stages, there was never their intention to get very big. But it is an interesting question you raised, Gautam and Rishi. I think that, and I've thought about that recently as I get older, why Japanese companies last so long and why they're so stable and sturdy. There may be a lesson for the rest of us. I'm not sure, but I think it's worth watching.
I agree, especially in this craze for raising capital, doing startups in one kind of way, which is what we all seem to aspire for. Um, and start and then
The average corporation in America has a lifespan of less than 20 years, including public companies. They're not durable. If you look on the list of Dow Jones 30 industrials of 1995 or so, less than half exist today. And these are 30 largest companies in America 30 years ago. International Harvester, Bethlehem Steel, Woolworth. See, they're all gone. They said, well, that's because America's a dynamic culture. Sorry?
in a sense it's almost unbelievable because you are the largest company, so you have all the resources, and you would think that you would be able to ride out storms.
Yeah. Well, some get bought out, but Eastman Kodak in 1994 was, I think, the fifth largest company in America. Eastman Kodak. In 12 years, they were gone. Now, how does this happen? They saw, the irony is Eastman Kodak invented and patented digital photography, and they still died. They invented digital photography. They understood solid state camera stuff. And so these are interesting corporate stories I kind of dwell on in class because there's a lesson there for entrepreneurs as well. That's a nice 3-hour case, Eastman Kodak. Oh, amazing.
So, George, in everyone's life, the incident occurs which inspires them to become an investor or as a business development. So, I guess you might have the similar incident. Could you please describe more about your incident?
You have good questions, guys. This is,
I can imagine.
well, okay, thank you. I always love to talk about myself, so you don't need to encourage me. I am not an entrepreneur. I'm not a born entrepreneur. My grandfather, both my grandfathers, my father, they were all entrepreneurs. And I saw them work like hell. And I said, that's not for me. I'm going to go to college and, just check out, So I got a job as a computer programmer, like every other conformist Asian kid does. And I worked for 17 years at a defense contractor in Los Angeles. We were building submarines. However, after 17 years, my division was cut loose. The management of the parent company said, we don't want you guys anymore. We're going to spin you off. If you don't want to be spun off, we're going to fire everybody. So I was introduced to entrepreneurship because I was basically forced into it because I didn't have a job. So it was myself and about 30 or 40 other guys who were now in this lifeboat. The parent company that spun us off said, we'll fund you and we'll be a customer, but you're not part of the mothership anymore because you are not strategic to where we want to go. Now, the company we were doing as a spinoff, this was in 1985, 86, this is almost 40 years ago, was cloud computing. We had cloud computing in the 80s. It had a different name. It's called time sharing, but we thought that maybe this cloud computing thing is going to work. So off we go. And sure enough, time sharing worked. And our company went public on the New York Stock Exchange. Luck. That's how I got into entrepreneurship. I did not plan to be an entrepreneur at all. I was just part of a group, and we were forced into it because the Lusitania was sinking, and they put us on a lifeboat, and you get to go to Greenland or you drown. So we made a go of it, and it turned out okay. It went public, and when it was public, it was sold to British Telecom. It all worked out very well. After that, I got a job at Cisco because now I'm this supposed expert in this stuff. And again, luck. Cisco was on a rocket ship. I got stock options, and boom. And then after about 7 years of that, I wrote 2 books. I had 2 predecessors of the book that you have, Rishi. And a venture capitalist read my book. It was called Residential Broadband. You can still look. It's still available on Amazon, I think. And this was published in 1997. What's that? 26 years ago it was published. And it talked about Wi-Fi and digital TV and cable networks and all that stuff. Nobody knew that, was writing books about that. But I wrote a book because Cisco allowed me. And the VC said, you want to be a VC? The point being, I was invited into the venture capital business. I did not ask for that job. In fact, for anyone who asks, how do I become a VC? The answer is you're invited in. You do not apply for the job. You do not knock on doors because everyone's going to say no. It's such a cushy plus job that it's not a job you apply for, at least in California. And so I'm sitting at Cisco minding my own business, and the guy taps me on the shoulder and says, you want to be a VC? He did not know me from Adam. We had lunch 2 or 3 times, and he asked one question that was important to him. That one question that was important to him was, can you bring me deals? And now I had been at Cisco for 7, 8 years, and I said, well, heck yeah, I got all kinds of deals. We're buying companies left and right. You want to meet an entrepreneur in this space? And I know these people. And so when I convinced him that I had deal flow, he hired me almost sight unseen. So when people ask, how did you do it? How about getting lucky and being invited to the party? I did not ask to go to the party. In fact, I didn't even know a party existed. So that's now. Is that how it's done today? Probably not. This was 23 years ago. This happened to me, but that's how it happened to me. And in fact, that's how it happened to a lot of people. About getting into venture capital, the key thing was when I was at Cisco, I was in a group called business development. The role of business development was to be the eyes and ears for Cisco, looking outside the company to other smaller companies that we could acquire or license or partner with or something. But our job was to look for small companies. When people know that you're in the hot company, Cisco was the hot company, and you're in business development in the hot company, they come to you and asking you if you want to be a venture capitalist. And I would say of the 10 or 12 people in the business development group at Cisco, with maybe 2 or 3 exceptions, we all became partners in venture capital firms. All of us, except for a couple. And one of them stayed and he became a big time lawyer. So he's a hugely successful group of people. So that's how it's done. That's a very unsatisfactory answer for students because, well, it takes years.
Yeah. So when you're talking about the Cisco, it brings me nostalgia to me because before I started my career, I took a training of a Cisco certified course called CCNA, but I didn't pass that exam.
That's a hard test. Guess what? I couldn't pass the test. Cisco is a great company. It still is a great company. And to this day, I still own the stock. I've had the stock for 33 years. And needless to say, it allowed me to afford me the possibility of being a professor, because without that, I couldn't be a professor. Evolution of the venture capital landscape. Well, it's a good question. As I said, I was invited in. I was invited in because of some self-promotion by writing a couple of. I did not intend to be a VC when I wrote 2 books. It just that's raises the point. Why do people write books? Why did Shakespeare write plays? Was he thought he was going to make money? And why did Mozart write? Mozart did write symphonies because he was getting paid, but mostly people write stuff because they have to. They can't sleep at night unless. And the reason for that is I was reading 20 years ago, which all kinds of books and articles about entrepreneurship, and I couldn't stand it. What I was reading, I thought was complete BS. And I was asked to edit a couple of books, and I made comments. And when I made comments on other people's books, they ignored all my comments. But they still acknowledged me in the book. I was like, okay, well. But I just did not like what I saw. So I wrote that book because I had to get something off my chest. Because even today you read stuff on entrepreneurship. It's all about you can be a billionaire and brainstorming and entrepreneurial mindset. What a bunch of crap. And that's not how it is. Now what that it's morphed into a bit. We can talk about entrepreneurial mindset in this lecture if you want, but that's peeve of mine. But as far as the landscape goes, I would say today, I would say it's much more amateurish than when I was doing it. Not that I was all that great, but I met some extraordinary people in the venture community 20, 30 years ago. I'm not meeting those people anymore. They're younger, they're energetic and smart as can be. There's no question about ambition, energy, intelligence. But their lack of self-awareness and their lack of humility, I find a bit disturbing. Which is why you have Theranos, which is why you have WeWork, and a lot of things. It's a product. The current VC landscape has been a product of just too much capital, and you have too much capital because interest rates are too low. And once interest rates gets to be, maybe they're too high now. I don't know. I'm not on the Fed, but I do know having real interest rates less than 0, which is the interest rates less inflation, in which case it makes no sense to hold cash. That is the recipe for bad investment and bad people going into the space. There's all this stuff flooding into the market, dragging in unqualified people in its wake, and that's my grumpy, curmudgeonly impression of what's happening now. Because like I say, the people I met at Kleiner Perkins, at Weiss Pick and Gray. I still have a good friend who at Lightspeed Ventures, terrific guy, Barry Eggers. You don't see that many people like that anymore. And that's why I think it's easier to be a VC now than ever. All you got to do is have access to money, and there's plenty of it. There's less of it now than there was a month ago, but um, it was harder to raise a fund 25, 30 years ago, even adjusted for inflation. And so because of that, I think you're seeing a lot of bad deals. And the amount of money that's going to be lost in AI is going to be gigantic.
What you say reminds me of a long time back. I mean, I started my career in Fidelity as an equity analyst, and one of the books I had read, a friend had given it to me. It was called Black Swan by Nicholas Taleb. And reading that, I remember in the early part of the book, he talks about when the times are good, any trader is a star trader. You just and he talks about specifically about some traders, and I think in Morgan Stanley, and driving sports cars. And but then when the market corrects itself, and he says that's when you know who the really good traders are. and and I think you're right. Something similar is happening in the VC world today.
AI is real. There's no question. It's got legs. It's going to happen, but it's way overfunded, and the clarity of thought I don't think is that good. I think a lot of people who are investing in AI don't know what an LLM is and can't tell the difference between a neural network and regression analysis. And so it's if you're investing in this kind of AI, why don't you invest in a statistical blah blah blah? It's the same thing almost for a lot of people. Sorry, I'm saying, okay, time out. I'm not there. I had one investment I did. My last investment was about 3 or 4 years ago, and it went public. And it was, it's not because I did a lot of diligence. It's because I knew the people involved. I didn't know the space. It was esports. I have no idea what makes esports work. I had no clue, but I did have confidence in the people. And so I said, well, here's somebody. And then boom, it went public. Oh, great. But it was just a class act that I was backing. I just don't see, there's a lot of class acts of really smart people today. It's just that the ratio, I think, is less favorable than it was before. That's all. And think about it's happening today. It happened in 2008. It happened in 2002. It happened in 1989, around there, the real estate. Every 10, 15 years, it's again and again. There's an article I read, I think today, about WeWork. The subtext was the bankruptcy of WeWork, VCs haven't learned a thing. And then there's an article that came right after that on my feed where Charlie Munger, the partner of Warren Buffett, said venture capitalists today are a bunch of thieves. And amen.
Yeah. Charlie Munger is I love his writing.
Charlie Munger's a fantastic guy. He's just a curmudgeonly old guy like me. And people say, well, Professor, you're just jealous you're not in venture capital anymore. I said, not jealous. I'm glad.
In fact, this cycle that we are discussing reminds me of Ray Dalio's thinking. I mean, he says that everything repeats itself. I mean, his whole investment strategy was reading history and saying everything is already happened before, and you just need to read it and it'll happen again.
One thing that doesn't seem to change over the last 10,000 years is human nature. You read ancient Indian sutras and Greek tragedies, and it's the same people. The technology is different, but otherwise, The people are the same.
And
Yes.
it also shows us, I mean, despite us thinking that we're all very different, in the core, it's the same. We're all the same. We have the same nature, and we make the same mistakes, and we do it repeatedly.
I think markets are efficient. What? Markets are efficient? How about greed and fear? Is that efficient? No. But that's what motivates markets and people. So anyway,
No, these are the things that I think these are the most insightful things, and this is where we all need to learn from. You were saying something about Charlie Munger, right? I love.
people should read Charlie Munger.
Yeah, they should. They should. They should. I mean, I listened to some of his investor calls. I mean, the day Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger sit together and answer questions, and I love his short answers. They are more profound than many of these long calls.
It's, it is so good. I encourage people to buy 10 shares of Berkshire Hathaway because with a handful of shares, you can go to the shareholders meeting in Omaha in May. Um, I only went there once because there's like 12,000 people in a basketball arena at this shareholders meeting, but it was worth it. I couldn't even stay in Omaha because every hotel was booked up, so I had to stay across the river in Council Bluffs, Iowa. But for one time, it was worth it. And you do have to read the Berkshire Hathaway annual report. I think that's required reading every year. But young people don't read that.
I think we should. We all should. So I think this leads us well to the next question on, if you could share some anecdotes uh, and case studies from your time when you were as a venture capitalist and serving on startup boards, maybe discussing some common challenges and solutions you've encountered in these roles.
I'll leave the company name nameless. The company failed, um, but um, well, there's so many lessons. Which failure should I talk about? This was a company out of the California Institute of Technology, Caltech. Caltech is one of the preeminent schools on the planet for technology. JPL. I mean, they put people on the moon. This small little college in Pasadena, California. Probably highest average IQ points on the planet, really, given this number of people, and fantastic. So I had this PhD student who was working in an area called MEMS, micro engineer machinery, micro machines, small things. And his PhD advisor was the leading guy in the field. He had publications everywhere. So these two guys had this MEMS story, basically as a control system, and it had wide applications. And because of my background at Cisco, we decided the application would be switching, fiber optic switching. And here's a case of falling in love with the people, falling in love with the technology and the possibility, and the company going absolutely nowhere. Now, to this day, I'm not sure why, but because the fact that MEMS as a genre has not succeeded, so there's something fundamentally wrong that I did not understand. But it was a case of basically falling in love with technology and having the right people technically and making the wrong bet. That was a puzzling thing to me then, and it's a bit puzzling now. What mistake did I make? And I still don't quite know. I wouldn't make the same bet again, of course, because I'm very suspicious of technology and people these days, much more so than I used to be. But it was that's one important lesson. Another important lesson was understanding markets or how markets are structured. So we had um, a UCLA professor who was a genius at wireless communications. He very good at it, and he had an antenna design for cell phone.
Right.
And this was done 20 years ago now. He had an antenna design which at the time provided for much better signal to noise ratio for phones. So you could faster speeds, more distance to the base station, and less power. Had everything you wanted in an analog thing. And we thought we had the answer to the antenna problem for cell phones, because that was an issue, when BlackBerry and Nokia and Ericsson was antennas. And so we thought we had the answer. We want to have every phone on the planet with our antennas. It didn't work.
Let's move to the first question. That what common misconceptions you observe in the among the young entrepreneurs, and how do you address this in your thinking?
Well, I'll repeat what I said before. I think one misconception entrepreneurs have is their idea is fantastic and that'll carry them to the finish line. Ideas are not that important. They're a necessary condition. You must have one, but it's a long way from sufficient. You have the American inventor Thomas Edison famously said, "Genius is 2% inspiration and 98% perspiration." I interpret that as mean the idea is worth 2%, and 98% is sales, marketing, operations, HR, supply chain, all that boring stuff that most entrepreneurs don't want to deal with, because entrepreneurs want to deal with creativity and innovation and brilliance and no one thought of this before and all that stuff. That's not where it is. It's the boring stuff that gets you to the finish line. So that's the misconception. So the idea is what you need. No. An idea, the value of an idea is that it motivates a team, and that's it. It's the thing that gets a team together. And once you have the team, your job is to execute on these other things. So that's one misconception. Another misconception is you have to be first to market. I'm brilliant. I'm creative. No one thought of this before. I'll win. Oh, no. How many spreadsheets existed before Excel? 4. At least I know 4. How many word processors existed before Microsoft Word? How many social media sites existed before Facebook? Does anyone remember Friendster, MySpace?
There's the Orkut
Yes, I started also with Orkut.
by Google. Orkut.
Orkut.
Orkut was the one in Asia.
Okay, yeah. Okay, I have a list. It's one of my lectures is on who were the 8 best known browsers in 1999. Browsers. Netscape, NCSA Mosaic, Prodigy. Not one exists anymore. 8 browsers preceded Explorer and Safari and whatever. 8 died. So first to market, second, no. It's not the idea. It's how many video conferencing software services existed before Zoom or before WebEx or before GoToMeeting. None of those were the start. The first one I think was Placeware, and they're gone. So anyway, first to market loses. Another misconception, or not, is you bet the jockey and not the horse, meaning you bet the management team, because if you have the right management, they will fix problems. And if you have bad management, they'll ruin a good problem, a good market, good product. So a lot of investors and observers say, bet the jockey. That's of course, very good advice. But there's another group of equally sharp people who say, no, don't worry about the jockey. Bet the market. Because if you're in a good market, you can get another jockey. You can fire the management team. I happen to be in that camp. You can't fix markets, but you can fix management by replacing it. But okay, so what again, everything I say has an exception to it. There's no rule here. Betting the jockey is fine, betting the market's fine. Don't accept either is a misconception when it's applied all the time. Another misconception, I have no competition, is a great thing. No. What competition gets you is validation. If somebody smart thinks that this is a good market, they're going to compete. When now it could be that you are you are so brilliant. You're the only person in the world that thought of cloud computing or whatever. Well, maybe that happens from time to time, but that's a terrible way to bet. You look for some competition. Of course, competition cannot be predatory. It can't crush you, but you need to see some evidence that somebody else thinks this is a good idea. So when a entrepreneur tells me they have no competition, I say, well, have you looked hard enough? And often they haven't. Another misconception entrepreneurs have is it's all about themselves. Entrepreneurs as the lone ranger, the hero, the solitary cowboy. No, it's team. It's your ability to assemble and manage a team. That's what wins. Um, another myth. I got so many. Another misconception is a lot of entrepreneurs think they have to be the lowest priced person on the market because they're afraid of competitive pricing. I can't charge more than the next guy because I'm the new guy and I don't have economies of scale. Well, that's true. You are the new guy. You do not have economies of scale. On the other hand, if the basis of your competition is pricing, you will lose because you don't have economies of scale. The big guy is going to crush you. So you have to charge premium. And how do you charge premium? You got to have a premium product. So, too many entrepreneurs want to go cheap. You can't do that.
This going cheap could also be a symptom of many entrepreneurs not focusing on sales and the more boring stuff. I mean, I find
No. They are focused on sales. They think
on 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 the sales itself, but investing in sales, and I mean, I know of a couple of course, this might be just anecdotal and may not be evidence of the larger startup ecosystem, but I had a couple of good friends who had great products. They spent all the time improving the product. But when it came to selling it, they just didn't invest early enough in a proper sales team. They just didn't think it was important enough.
well, yeah, that's obviously that's a huge mistake. But it depends on product. But if the product is a B2B product, then the founder, the technical person, the founder is the salesperson. You do not staff up because the early buyers, again, you're the new company. No one knows who you are. I don't want to talk to a sales guy. I want to talk to the guy who invented this or the founder. And a lot of entrepreneurs, and I would say particularly in many cases Asians, don't like to sell. Americans have no trouble selling. They got the personality. They don't mind doors getting slammed in their face. That's great. That's one thing great about America. Fearless. But a lot of Asians say, well, I can't sell. I got to get somebody else to do it for me. No, you have to sell because that customer wants to meet you.
Yeah, when you're talking about the idea, that reminds me, I recently went to an event and I met once a young startup founder.
Mhm.
He told me that if you have an idea, don't go to market. First, try to sell within your family. If your family buys the idea, then definitely other people will also buy your idea.
Another mistake entrepreneurs have is they invent something. I have a mouse. It's a better mouse than the mouse I got. and they think they have a company. A product is not a company. A product is just something a company does. A company is a machine to make other products. So don't get all excited about your product as being the thing that'll get you to the finish line. It's not. It's going to have to be tailored and, you know, improved. You're going to have to do some continuous improvement. That's why I don't have a problem with continuous improvement, because you don't know how well it fits the market until you get to that mass market thing. You know, your product may be okay for the early stage market, but it's not okay for the later stage market. So, you know, you're going to do this evolution thing, and how you evolve it is tricky, because, you know, how much money do you want to spend on it? It sounds like your friends spent too much money on it. Well, that's no good either. But you got to get the right enhancement here. So anyway, a product is not a company. A company is a machine for making products.
Just now that leads to our next question. So you know that most of our listeners are startup early stage founders, and they have many questions about fundraising. And could you please explain the process for our listeners for fundraising, and why do you think the investors often say no?
Fundraising is very location specific. So what works in LA will not work in Delhi. I've been to Delhi a lot, and it's a different thing. The investors in LA and California are way more sophisticated. And I've seen the interrogation that investors in Asia make, and it's like, I couldn't deal with these people. They're asking too much. They're too scared. So it's very location specific. And I say that the easiest place in the world for an entrepreneur to get money is in California. Sometimes it's too easy, like I said before. But and maybe because I just live here and, you know, I see deals every week. The sophistication, the maturity, the questioning, the Q&A, the treatment of entrepreneurs in California is much better than I've seen in Asia. The Europeans are getting very good. And I think in many cases I would take money from Sweden, from Finland, maybe from the UK. But they're getting better. That's because a lot of them got their MBAs at Harvard and Stanford, UCLA. Gautam, the question is very location specific. I think the way you raise money in California is very different from how you raise money elsewhere. I think it's, you know, I haven't tried to raise money in Asia, but my sense is it's very difficult given the kinds of questioning I've seen from Asian investors. Now, as far as the California story goes, you're right. Entrepreneurs say, well, I don't know anybody. How do I get to meet an investor? That's the first problem. Well, you got to meet investors. Well, how do you do that? You got to meet investors. You didn't answer my question, Professor. How do you do? You network. You go to, now, one of the good things about California is that there are events every week where investors and entrepreneurs get together over coffee or whatever all the time. The Los Angeles Venture Association, lava.org, LACI, the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator. UCLA's got an accelerator. In fact, at UCLA, we've got 3 accelerators. Stanford, of course, Berkeley, yeah, Caltech, every Saturday or almost every Saturday has this entrepreneur forum. So the opportunities, organized opportunities for entrepreneurs and investors to meet face to face are considerable here, and much more. In Japan, it's almost impossible. I'm trying to help fix that, but it's tough. But in California, it's a lot easier. So now, once you get to meet somebody, 95% of people will say, "I'm not interested in having lunch with you. No, I will not answer your email, etc." But if you can break through, then you're going to make a presentation The presentation could be anywhere from 7 to 15 minutes in front of either an angel group or a venture capital firm. And you're going to get some Q&A. Could be 10 minutes, could be an hour. At Palomar, I think the whole end-to-end process for an entrepreneur was an hour. And after the Q&A and the presentation, we'd say, thank you very much. We'll talk to you later. Sometimes we would, mostly we wouldn't. But after your presentation, there's going to be some due diligence performed by the investors. And then if they like what they see, the next step is a term sheet, which is basically a memo of understanding, a letter of intent that we will invest $1 million in your company in return for 20% of the company. Plus, we want board seats. We want board seats. We want this. We want that. And we want a bunch of terms. But it's an offer for cash. In which case, the entrepreneur can say yes or no. And then we go back and forth, and then we come to agreement. Then once you have an agreement, then you have another painful process of creating legal documents. Option agreement, purchase agreement, article of incorporation, all these, lawyers get involved. So from the start to the end, even in California, it's on average, I would say 6 months. So if you can't hang on for 6 months, you're going to run out of cash. But it's a very well-known and structured process in California. We know who the actors are. People know what the time limits are. And it's pretty transparent, and which is why we have the best deals.
I remember when I was in B school, and this is 20 years ago, in Fontainebleau. We had a VC who was an alumni, based out of Silicon Valley, but he was of French origin. He was visiting family, and he came by to give us a lecture. And I remember a lot of the European students in our class were asking him, why is it that you're based out of the US? Why aren't you here? Why aren't more VCs active, such as you, in Europe? I mean, you are, after all, from here. And basically, he said it's to do with two things. One is the culture, and the culture of failure, and how failure is perceived. And basically, he was talking about the bankruptcy laws, how very different it is in the US, and how failure is often almost a badge of honor there, and failure in Europe is just the opposite. And the other.
In Japan, it's a mortal sin. If you fail, you've cast aspersions on your ancestors, kind of thing. Sorry. Yeah.
It's extreme. And I think in most parts of Asia, failure, even in India, it's not looked upon very well.
A lot of native Indians do come to California. I've got one I'm working with now. He has, he lives in India. He invented a low-cost respirator. During COVID, it would have been the right thing. No, it's maybe less interesting now, but he had a pretty interesting respirator story. And he never tried to raise money in India. He hired an American partner, and whose job it was to raise money in California. Never even tried. He said, I'm not even going to try.
And that makes it, this whole startup ecosystem, difficult to kick off. And the other, he was, of course, and the bankruptcy laws reflect that. The bankruptcy laws are punitive to the entrepreneur who has failed.
I think that's true. However, I think because of the exorbitant amount of venture capital money that's been invested that will fail, I think the volume of failure is going to be so large over the next 2-3. This year, it's a horror story, and the amount of failure is going to get bigger and bigger. And that's going to be so a lot of people in India are going to say, "I told you so." That's my problem with all this profligate investing of VC money these days. It's just You know, the amount of money that's going down the tubes is just incredible.
Well, he was on the right track, I would say.
Which is not good for you.
Yeah, not a good thing for the Indian and Asian thinking and the European thinking as well, unfortunately. But hopefully this changes with time. And as you said, more and more globalization, more students studying in, UCLA, Harvard, and coming back. I think they will drive some of that change we need.
Yeah. No, to Gautam's question, but why do people say no? This is a good question because even though an investor likes the product, they'll like the team, they'll like the market, they think the time is right, they'll still say no. Why is that? Because maybe they've already overinvested in the field already. I've got 10 AI companies. I can't invest in you. That's number one. Uh, Number two is I'm out of money. That's the thing people don't know about VC funds. We had a $250 million fund, and after about $150 million of investments, we stopped. The other 100 million was left over for follow-on funding for the prior investees. So effectively, we're out of cash. And entrepreneurs don't know that. All they know is you got $100 million. So why can't I have some? So well, because we're saving it for some of our older children. That's number two. Number three, which is happening now, is you have a venture capital fund that raised money from limited partners, from some endowment, from investment bank, wherever. That endowment fund, that investment bank, that corporate fund, they're suffering losses on their public equity portfolio. And when their public equity portfolio drops 10%, then they got to drop their VC investments 10% in order to keep the right mix. Otherwise, they'll be overweighted in venture unless they ratchet back. So it's called the denominator effect. If we had a whiteboard, I could show you how the math works, but
They're already saying that.
it's real. So what do you have? You have competition in the portfolio. You're out of money because you want to keep dry powder. You have the denominator effect. Another reason is my comrades in Silicon Valley or some big time VCs. They decided they're going to stop investing, so I'm going to stop investing because I want to be like them. It's a herd mentality.
Yeah, it's driving some crazy behaviors and so on. So even yeah.
That's some element there too. So there's a lot of reasons why people say no, even though they like the deal.
Well, your explanation helps a little bit for them to when they hear no next time uh, to get an understanding of what's happening. That leads us well into the next section, more on the legal part. We talked a little bit about term sheets and Series A term sheets. What are the provisions that you think entrepreneurs should be aware of in when it comes to term sheets or a convertible note?
Well, they're very different. As far as term sheets go, of course, you got to think about valuation. You think about board of directors. And again, this depends on country. I'm talking about, and you may have English law here. I guess you did, um, but at least for my students, I tell them to worry about only two things: board of directors and valuation. There are other important provisions, but those are the top two. Other important provisions are liquidation preference, um, founder vesting, um, rights of first refusal, maybe redemption. This doesn't mean much to podcasters right now, but there are a host of terms that people have to come to terms with when they sign term sheets. Now, most entrepreneurs don't know what these mean, which means they got to learn, take my class, or get a lawyer. I don't advise people to get lawyers for term sheets because they're not binding. They're not legally binding documents, at least in the U.S. So I think that's could be a waste of money. But at some point, you're going to need a lawyer, and you best understand the terms on your own. Now, convertible notes, slightly different matter. You again worry about valuation. You might worry about discount, although that's not a big deal. And if you may want to worry about collateral and due dates on the note. Of course, convertible notes and safes are much simpler, no terms, since you're not buying stock, so that you can come to agreement much sooner. In which case, you're concentrating on the valuation, because that determines your convertibility when you get your next price round. Now, what people don't understand is the relationship between their convertible note or safe and the actual priced round, which may be a year, 2 years in the future, and they don't see how the arithmetic works. But, get on the Y Combinator website and go through the examples.
So I think one of the things that we would like to talk about would be equity compensation. I think Gautam and I were discussing that. Gautam, would you like to?
Sure. So when it comes to equity, so equity becomes the important aspects of the startups, especially when there are multiple founders involved. So how should entrepreneur approach equity distribution among the early employees?
Yeah, this is one area where very fuzzy, and I'll always disclaim to students who come to me that I'm giving them solid advice, because it depends on so many things I don't know about the particular company. What I can say is this: if you have, let's say, 3 founders, it almost certainly is a mistake to distribute equity a third, and a third. That's almost never the right allocation of equity, because each of the founders are going to bring something different to the party. Some may decide that they're not going to work full time at that startup. Well, but they're going to put in money. How do we trade that off? Somebody may want to put in a patent. I got the patent, but you got the cash, and Rishi here is going to put in all the time, and the other 2 of us are going to take a vacation. So how do people view, what does fairness mean in that context, especially since you've never done it before? I have no special insight into that, neither does anybody else. And just what are people willing to settle for, which is a function of what else do they have in their lives. Do they have a family? Do they need the cash? Does somebody need cash more than they need stock? And so it's going to be a complicated bargaining session with each of the founders. The first question, of course, is who is a founder? Why should Gautam be a founder? Well, because he's my friend, or because whatever. The start of Snapchat, or now Snap, had 3 founders. Bottom line is, 2 of the 3 founders kicked the 3rd guy out because he couldn't code. He was an English major. He couldn't code. So Evan Spiegel and his ally kicked out this 3rd guy. And of course, the 3rd guy ended up suing the other 2. Lawsuits among founders is not unheard of. But that's what happens when you don't come to closure on what each founder is going to contribute and how much equity they're going to get. One piece of advice I have given people is, let's say you have the third case. Well, you don't want to offend your friends, so we're going to make everybody happy, and everybody's going to get the same number of shares. Okay, great. But maybe in a year, there'll be an adjustment. And to do that, you need a stock option pool. So have an option pool that somebody who's, I don't know, but somebody will decide, okay, Rishi gets more stock, but Gautam doesn't get any more. And if he doesn't like it, too bad. So I think reserving some stock for that contingency is a reasonable thing to do. But I have not seen. I can't think of any company that student company I've dealt with that got out of this discussion unscathed. Almost in every case, somebody leaves. Sometimes happily, sometimes not. There's a lot of reading on this material, some of which I think I might have a reference in my book, and some I assign in class. But in general, equity is not assigned equally to all the founders, and you have to weigh time commitment, cash, contribution of other assets like patents.
Yeah. Um, I think the other core aspect of many entrepreneurship is intellectual property, and IP is a cornerstone of many startups. How should entrepreneurs approach the protection or acquisition of IP?
I'd say in general, well, if you've got a scientific engineering gizmo that is core to the success of your company, then you need to protect it some way. It doesn't have to be a patent. I am not a big fan of patents um, for two reasons, one of which they cost a lot of money, particularly if you want international coverage. If I want a patent in the United States and India and China and Japan and the European Union, which is what I'm going to need for anything that's reasonable, you're way north of 100,000 US dollars. And typically, to get proper coverage, you're going to need 3 or 4 patents. You're talking $500,000 commitment if you take the patent approach. Well, who's got that? No venture capitalist is going to invest $500,000 for a patent application process because they don't know if you're going to get the patent. So that's number one, cost. And a lot of great companies got started without patents. Great technical companies, Broadcom, for example. It's a professor at UCLA. He doesn't have any money. But sometimes you have to patent. There's no question that in certain instances, you don't have a company without a patent. If you have a pharmaceutical drug and you got a molecule that is the answer to Alzheimer's, you patent it because you don't want anybody else making the same molecule. Okay. Excepting for those situations when it's pretty clear, then you have to think about the cost and the time and the management time it takes to get a patent, because it takes a lot of effort to get a patent by the inventor, because they have to be negotiating with their patent lawyer or maybe the patent office as to what novelty means or obviousness means. Okay, so you got to be careful about what you patent. Another thing about patent, apart from cost, is that you are disclosing your invention. That's a requirement for a patent. Is that you enable other people. You enable fast followers. That's the intent of patent law, to educate the public. So if you don't want to educate the public, then you don't patent. Now, a lot of investors will say, "Well, I'll only invest in your company if you have a patent because so whatever," not knowing that it's the enabler of competition. That's kind of stupid. But it's not true in every case you have to patent. It's not true in no case you should patent. It's a judgment call. Some things you should patent. Some things should be trade secrets. So that's the one. What's the modality of your IP protection? You have 4. You have patents, trade secrets, copyrights, and trademarks. And which of those 4 modalities are you going to protect for which of your assets. Now, of course, trademarks and patents don't cover the same thing, but trademarks and copyrights could cover the same thing. Probably not, but you can copyright, you can trade secret, you can patent software. Software is protected by each of those three mechanisms. So which one of these three are you going to pick? Well, cost, duration protection, ability to inform fast followers. You got to think about that. So you have to take inventory of what are the key assets that I can or should protect by those four means. By the way, for many companies, the most important asset they have to protect is the trademark. The formula for Coca-Cola is not patented, but it's a trade secret. Now, of course, people know how to make cola drinks. That's not the point. The particular recipe for Coca-Cola is a trade secret. It's been a trade secret for over 100 years. That's not an important asset. The important asset of Coca-Cola is their trademark, because you see that red can and that script, you know it's Coca-Cola. I don't have to do any thinking as a consumer. I just buy it. So the brand is expressed in the trademark, and that's what makes trademarks super powerful. So that's kind of what you got to do is, let's see. Okay, this thing here is trademarked. You cannot make this shirt with this design on it. You're not allowed to. Of course, people do it, but they're not allowed. It's trademarked. I think the trademark licensing business at UCLA is something like $20 million a year in royalties. It's one of the most valuable university logos. Oxford, Harvard, UCLA. It's kind of in that order.
I should have worn my UCLA cap. My brother had gifted it to me last time he came.
Hey, thank you. The royalties went right to the campus. So yeah, you do have to pay attention to your IP, but don't necessarily get it all excited about patents.
Right. Well, I've been meaning to ask you for this for a while. You've been a professor at UCLA Anderson School of Management since now 2003, focusing on entrepreneurship among other subjects. So I wanted to understand your motivation to transition into academia. You didn't start off there, but you moved in there. And how's the experience been for you? And how did it enrich your perspective on entrepreneurship?
Okay, first of all, I wanted to teach since I was in college. I've been wanting to be a teacher for 60 years, 50 years. So I was in the PhD program at UCLA because I knew the life of a teacher. I didn't want to set the world on fire, becoming a multi-billionaire. I like the teaching life. I like being on campus. I just like UCLA. If I couldn't teach at UCLA, I don't think I would have been a teacher. There's only like three schools I would have taught at: Caltech, Berkeley, and UCLA. That's it. But I was in the PhD program, and guess what? I flunked out. I took some exam and I did terribly, and I was invited to find other things to do by UCLA. So I'm roaming the wilderness for 40 years, and I got very lucky with Cisco. Cisco is not by the way, Cisco is not a job I applied for. I was invited into Cisco because I was not an expert, but they thought I was an expert about cloud computing in 1990. I wasn't, but I was there. I wasn't nearly as smart as the other 40 people I worked with at Infinite. But I was invited in, made some money. Then I was invited into venture capital, made a little more money. And I was fired from the venture capital firm. Said, okay, gone, out. You're out of here. So I said, well, what am I going to do now? I looked at my pocketbook and I says, I can retire now. After Cisco and after venture capital, I don't have to work anymore. I was 53. I was 56 years old then. I said, well, that's a little early to retire, but I could retire. And so I was out of work for about 4 to 6 months, and I went crazy. I hated retirement. And so, lucky for me, Al Osborne, bless his heart, at UCLA, tapped me on the shoulder and says, we just fired one of our professors of entrepreneurship. We need an interim. Will you do this for free? We can't pay because you're not up in the academic calendar. Say sequencing timing was wrong. We can't pay you, but I know you want to teach, so why don't you give it a shot? And I said, of course. Now, I didn't have a syllabus. Al said, use my syllabus. I said, well, okay, it's not a great syllabus, but okay, I'll teach from it. But what I ended up doing all day was telling Cisco stories and telling venture capital stories. Students loved it. And my ratings were very good. And, and two more quarters of no pay. I went a year without money. It was okay. I did enjoy it, telling Cisco stories, because there's dozens I haven't told you yet. And then they hired me. Yeah. Yes, I have been very fortunate. I do keep a file of emails from students. It's Professor blah, blah. I keep it from my ego. On those days when I feel bad, I read some of these things people send back. And I still get gifts from people from 10 years ago, wine and things, IPO. And I got some rich students. They're richer than me. Um, but that's how that happened. So the answer is I wanted to be a teacher. I didn't qualify, but after 40 years of work experience, they invited me in. So Cisco, venture capital, UCLA are the three best jobs I ever had, and I didn't apply for a single one of those. That's called luck. So that's my charmed life. And I'll do this until I can't remember my notes anymore, which is becoming a problem, by the way.
We've loved every minute talking to you so far, so I can imagine what the students felt. It makes me think if only I could be a student in your class now.
I'm happy to do this again with you guys. I seriously thoroughly enjoyed this. This is great.
Well, from our discussion, it doesn't seem to be a problem at all, and we've loved every minute. I'm mindful of the time, so we will have one last question, and then we'll wind up for today. Though there are so many other sections and so many other things that we would love to know.
You guys, next time you guys got to fly me to India. I want to go there again. I go there like once every 2 years, and it's been a while. So
Well, that would be great.
Yes.
So I think as a last question, as and it was a good follow-up question. As a long-standing professor of entrepreneurship, I'd love to know how do you value, um, do you think learning entrepreneurship is, even for those who don't get into entrepreneurship or don't want to start up a company?
this is one of my first lectures. This class is good for you, even if you don't plan to be an entrepreneur, for a variety of reasons. One of which is, like me, you may lose your job. Knowing entrepreneurship is your best form of job security because it teaches you that it can be done. You're not going to starve to death. It just takes a few things you got to know, and you got to, above all, ask the right questions. But yeah, even if you think you're going to be at Birla for life, they may just say, "Okay, we're going to get rid of you," and that's what happened to me. So that's number one. It's job security. It's something you should know. Number two, it gives you a sensitivity for how small companies think and work. So that you may be in a big company, but you may have small company partners, joint ventures, customers, and it's good to know how they think and what makes them paranoid and how they're going to react to certain situations. I think it's a good sensitivity awareness about some of your potential business partners. Number three, this is an important one because when you work in a big company, typically you're stuck in a silo. You're an engineer, you do engineering for 80 hours a week, that's it. Sales, same thing. But when you're an entrepreneur, you don't have that luxury of being in a silo. You got to do everything, or you at least got to do 2 or 3 things. Every engineer in the startup company I worked with, every engineer had to sell because they had to answer calls from potential customers. So they at least were sales support. So you had to have these multiple hats when you're an entrepreneur. And that's a good thing to know when you're in a big company because too often you get stuck in a silo. Um, and then, after you retire, you may want to indulge a hobby. I like to cook. I like to, whatever. And maybe I could make a little business out of my hobby after I retire. That's perfectly sane thing to do. So I think, I think entrepreneurship should be required in MBA programs for those reasons. I think it helps people even if they don't plan to be an entrepreneur.
Well, I think on that note, we want to say thank you for taking the time. It's been an absolute pleasure,
Yes.
and wish you good night.
Yeah, good night, George.
Good night. Thank you. My pleasure as well. I enjoyed it. Good day.